have you in my home. I don't know if it feels strange for you, but it feels strange for me seeing your familiar faces here. But anyway, welcome to you ladies, and hope you enjoy the information and the discussion. What I'm going to do is talk about near-death experiences and the afterlife beliefs of ancient Indigenous people. And I was just wondering, does anyone here has had a near-death experience? Yes, you have, Tim? Yeah? Yeah. There's a few people who've sort of connected with this group, and they have as well, but they haven't been able to make it yet. But anyway, I hope they'll come along and share that with the group too. I guess I picked this topic because, one, I'm interested in, well, there are two topics I'm interested in. Ancient and Indigenous cultures and near-death experiences. And I was thinking, you know, people are having near-death experiences now. How might they be different from those that were reported in the past? If there are similarities cross-culturally, what does that mean? And you know that some of the skeptics, you know, people will say that the near-death experiences are a confabulation of the dying brain of human beings, and this is, you know, it's something that our minds just make up, and there's nothing really to it. And I don't agree with that for all sorts of reasons. And I thought, well, you know, what are those commonalities that may go back through history, if we can find any at all? And sort of explore those. So that's what I wanted to do today, why I picked this subject. So I've picked out a few different civilizations and Indigenous groups. I have to say, what I found after having my nose buried in the computer like this, reading for about the last week or two, is that while there are similarities to the near-death experiences that are reported today, there's also some differences. And that is that the experiences from history are more organic. So that they don't have stories of going through a tunnel when someone's having a near-death experience or something like that. They're more about walking along a path, walking over a fallen tree that's gone over a river or something like that. So I found that was one of the first differences I noticed. Also, there was a lot of judgment in historical cases too, and Indigenous cases. And it started to, as I read lots of them, they started to me, to appear more and more like the older, more ancient ones, or the Indigenous ones particularly, were more like a shamanic experience, like a shamanic initiation, rather than what we have in Western understanding as a near-death experience. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But first of all, let's just start off with, going back, let's start with the Mesopotamians. So we're going back to 3100 BC to 539 BC. And this consisted of a group of the Akkadians, the Assyrians, Babylonians, I think there was another group, and the Sumerians too. So now, the ancient Mesopotamians believed in a netherworld as the cosmic opposite to what life is like here. And it was like a shadowy version of life on Earth. And metaphysically it was thought to lie a great distance from the realm of the living, but physically it lay underground and is described as located only a short distance from the Earth's surface. I thought that was very interesting. It was probably the only one that I actually read where it was just very close to Earth, because all the others, they seem to be, the afterlife is very far away and they've got to go on a journey and a trip and go somewhere off into, you know, wherever. But there's always a distance involved. So in Mesopotamian mythology, we find the story of Inanna and her descent to the netherworld. And she was a bit of a cheeky so-and-so from what I can understand. She decided she wanted to go and check out her sister's underworld called, her sister was called Ishkagal, I think, or something. And but when she went there, she died, but she was reborn. So she actually went to this underworld kingdom, and it was called the Great Below. And it says here, in her descent from the realm of light into the darkness of the netherworld, Inanna passes through 7 gates, and at each gate is forced to leave behind part of her earthly symbols of power. And that was at the first gate. And then so as she progresses through all these other gates, she leaves behind other things like beautiful robes and other parts which I imagine represent various egotistical parts of herself, till the point where she gets to the 7th gate. And here she has to enter naked and bowed low. And the 7 judges of the great low, the Anunnaki, UFO people pay attention, then pass sentence on her. And they fasten their eyes on her, the eyes of death, so that she sickens and dies. And Inanna's corpse is hung on a spike, but after 3 days and 3 nights she is revived and rises from the dead to return to the great above of the earth and the sky. And this really reminded me of, again, in shamanism, and I actually undertook some more training in shamanic practice recently. I've been interested in shamanism for about 7 years and learning and practicing and teaching what I'm learning. And I had to go through a dismemberment journey before I could actually do something they call transfiguration. And when I was doing that, and I read Inanna's story, it just very much reminded me of my own shamanic dismemberment journey, which again is very much like a modern near-death experience story, except that in the modern near-death experience reports, we don't tend to identify the same steps as they did in the ancient times. So in my own, and I'll just read this just so you understand what I'm saying, hopefully. But in the dismemberment journey that I did, I had to go to the lower world, and when you're doing shamanic practice, how many people here have done some sort of shamanic work here? Yeah. So when you're doing that, you're going into an altered state of consciousness to the beat of a medicine drum, which we've got a few over there, and or to rattles or whatever you like. And when you enter that altered state of consciousness, then you go with your power animals and you go on a journey and you access information. So in this dismemberment journey, which is really like an initiation, a shamanic initiation, which modern NDEs have also been described as being akin to as well. That through this one that I went down a slippery slide on land that opens to ocean, and I slipped off a layer of skin. And as I did that, I took a dip in the ocean, and I came out of that, and the sun was sparkling on my wet body. And then I jumped into one of those big deep holes that you see on Discovery Channel and some of those unusual things around the planet, and they've got in the ocean, and they're just like bottomless, and they're really deep blue. So I sort of jumped into that and came out and slipped off another layer of skin, and then walked on a hot, arid, dry salt lake, and I was like, this is all in an altered state of consciousness, right? And then I flew up into the atmosphere, into outer space, and then I fell hurtling back to the earth, and all these things sort of went on, and I'd slip off another layer of skin, and there was one stage I was forced by my power animals to jump down a waterfall, and being tumbled along these rapids in the river, and while I'm doing them, getting all battered and bruised, and I come out and I look pretty gruesome, and I stand up and that all slips off. So it was very similar. That whole process of that was very similar to what I thought the Inanna story was, where she had to go through these gates, and each time she did, she had to disrobe something or lose something, so that in the end she came to that place where she was, bowed and lowly, and really had taken all those things off so she could rebuild herself again, where she was then reborn. And in a shamanic experience and in near-death experiences, people have that happen to them as well, where they lose parts of themselves and they come back as a changed person. And then, relatives often say, well, that person's just not the same as what they used to be. You know, completely different person. Daniel Brinkley talks about being he was a real so-and-so, and after his near-death experience, he became quite a likeable, compassionate person, whereas before he was completely not. So I found that really interesting, this comparison with shamanic experience. Anyway, so we've got the Aztecs. Now they emerged in about the 13th century, and when the Spaniards arrived in Mexico, they actually encountered the Nahuan people, and the Nahuan people were doing a celebration of I think it was the Day of the Dead, and to the Mexico, the souls exist after death, but they rest in a place called Mictlan. And I don't know if you heard of any of those sort of stories when you were there, Lee?
I went to Midland.
Yeah.
It's an actual place.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Very good. But it's considered the land of the dead, believe it. And so each year they have this celebration when they do this dance, and where the dead can return home and visit their relatives. So I've actually just got a little. There's some of the beautiful headgear that they wear in the celebration. So I'm guessing that Mictlan is probably the centre where they have the biggest ceremonies and dances like that, those rituals for the Day of the Dead, I'm guessing. So let's have a look at the Maoris. Now, an old native belief in Maori culture is that when a person is near the point of death, the spirits of his dead forebears come forward from the spirit world in order to guide the deceased soul to spirit land. And we see this happens in modern near-death experiences. People report too that they'll often see, they will often see deceased relatives or friends sometimes too, who will come and they'll visit them. And that book that I was telling you about before, I just ordered, it's called The Art of Dying. It's by Dr. Peter Fenwick. And in that he talks about the various stages that people, like that when someone's dying, things can start to happen, paranormal experiences can start to happen up to 2 weeks before someone actually dies. They're identifiable steps, and one of them is that that people see their deceased loved ones, but it happens at a certain particular time in accordance with the progress of the death experience. And I thought that was really interesting too. In fact, I thought I might do the next meeting about that, but anyway. So they travel along the path to the spirit land where they congregate at the sacred meeting place of the spirits. And from there, they pass to one of the two spirit worlds, to the heavens or the underworld. And each spirit seems to have made its choice as to its ultimate destination. And apparently there's nothing to dread in either case, because there's no punishment of the spirit after death in Maori belief. Now that's the only one that I actually came across where there was no judgment, no punishment, nothing like that at all. So you can see similarities anyway, just in those couple of cases of, compared to modern reports of near-death experiences. And I think that looking at the cases where people are outside of, or in places where they don't have access to other knowledge, they only have their own culture. For example, the people I'm going to talk about next to the Mabutu Pygmies over in Congo in Africa, and who are very resistant to any outside influences. And when you have the stories that are very similar or are the same as near-death experiences arising out of these remote cultures, then you start to see that near-death experiences are not just confabulations of the dying, right? Or in our culture, I would say, but there is something, even though there are differences in some cultures and similarities, it seems to be something that is inherent to the human experience and around the time of dying. And whether that's part of our spiritual heritage or not, I'm not really sure. It may be. We have a biological heritage, we call it DNA, But you know, we have other heritages as well, and maybe we have a spiritual heritage that we just are yet to understand. But in some field work that was done, and I couldn't find the name of the person who did the field work, but this is from they did the field work with the Mabuti Pygmies in the 1920s. Obviously this isn't a photo from them. But they were saying, according to a local shaman, after death the soul left the body and was surrounded by spirits. And these spirits would pounce on the deceased and throw the wicked in the fire, which is somewhere deep in the earth, but the good would go to live with the creator god, Mungu, who looked like a man but was also identified with rainbows and snakes. And when asked how they knew about the afterlife, they said it was knowledge that came from previous shamans. And again, going back to the shamanic initiation experience where they have this death and rebirth process. So, we look at the Solomon Islands. This is a photo, you can't see the writing, it's of warriors of Western Solomon Islands taken in 1895. And some more field work that was done then, from 1908 to 1909, found that the people of the Solomon Islands believe that the soul leaves the body at death and either ascends to the afterlife realms or walks there along a road. I remember one show in MASH. Did anyone ever watch MASH? The TV show. And there was one where people had died and the dead were walking along the road. Do you remember that one? Yeah, it was a very strange one, but anyway, it was interesting too. Anyway, the deceased is met by a warden and interrogated. And this thing of interrogation often comes up too in the Indigenous societies. And if they are deemed to be good, they give the warden some beads or shells, and then they're allowed to pass and told which path to take. But if a person is bad, they're led on the path of pigs and dogs, either getting lost or delayed, or eaten by the pigs and dogs, and suffer a second death or complete annihilation. So that's an interesting, sort of afterlife belief. But there are a number of intermediary places on the way, such as volcanoes and islands, and they're met by ancestors and they ask who they are. And they've got to identify themselves and their clan so that they'll be accepted. And so again, there's this process of, this interrogation continues. There seems to be steps in their stories regardless of how it's shrouded in their understanding. But there are steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, just like that these Indigenous people go through with near-death experiences as well. Anyway, after they figure out who the ancestors say, "Who are you?" They're again interrogated and must give their clan identification before being welcomed and bathed and fed and massaged in order to repair the body. And only then can they stay and continue in the afterlife, remaining invisible to the living. And they believe that when a corpse returned to life after a near-death experience, that they were assessed in the other world and sent back. So they just didn't want them, apparently, and they sent them back. Now, the Native Americans, I found there are a lot of near-death experience cases recorded in the Native American history. And it was recorded by a lot of people, a lot of men who had been sent there to, they'd be sent ahead of progress being made, so-called progress being made. But these men became very interested in the Native Americans, and they would talk to the shamans and the medicine men and people who had died, and they recorded their stories of what had happened to them. So again, going to some field work that was, that's right. This is, now Dr. Gregory Shutan, I must give him some credit here because he's done a lot of work with cross-cultural studies of afterlife and afterlives and near-death in early civilizations. And he's a religious researcher, so he's been looking at the tribes, the Indigenous people's understandings and beliefs. So Yale University, a lot of anthropologists and archaeologists will have collected information when they've gone to these other places, and they've recorded what some of the local people have told them. And it's all available on the Yale University website, which is apparently huge. But I couldn't access it because of not being part of that level of being able to access it. But not being an academic. But this Gregory Shushan, he has done a lot of work with that and gone through many cultures. And so from him, he talks about in 1585 in Virginia in USA about the Algonquin people. And he talks about a man called Thomas Harriot who reported the first known Native American near-death experience. And men gave Harriet some accounts of the men who had died but revived to tell of their experience. First man was a wicked man who went to a hellish place but was returned to by a god to teach his people as to how to avoid such negative fates. And the second man went to a more positive realm, to a place of abundance, an idealised mirror image of earth where he met his deceased father, who sent him back to tell the people about the happiness in the other realm. Again, you can see similarities to some of the modern near-death experience reports that people have. Now, Captain John Smith, you remember him in the story of Pocahontas? Well, he was the sometime governor of Virginia and admiral of New England, and he wrote in 1623 that these Native American people that he had met, they believed the immortality of the soul, and when life departs from the body, according to the good or bad works they have done, it's carried up to the tabernacles of the gods to perpetual happiness, or to a place called Papagusso, which is a great pit. I don't know why it's a good place, but it's a great pit, but there you go. But when you're looking at a Native American stories at this time, 1580 to 1631, this is before the Christians are actually going around proselytizing to the Native Americans. So they've already got this understanding of an afterlife, and it's a place that they can go and visit in an altered state of consciousness sometimes, without any of these other sort of beliefs coming in and feeding those things to them. Now, to confirm, now Smith says, they told me of two men that had been lately dead and revived again, and one happened a few years before our coming into the country, of a bad man who was dead and being buried. And the next day the earth over him was seen to move and was taken up. And he told them his soul was very near entering into Papagusso, but one of the gods saved him and gave him leave to return again to teach his friends what they should do to avoid such torment. Now in their stories there's none of this this question of they want to stay there in the afterlife place. And people say, or beings say to them, no, you must go back, you must go back. There's not didn't read many of those stories of that sort of negotiation and, deep felt requests of wanting to actually stay in the afterlife. So that's one of the differences that came up for me in the modern, according to the modern near-death reports. And the other one was, it happened the same year that we were there. This is Smith talking, about 60 miles from us. And I was told that the one being dead and buried was taken up the same as the first. And although his body had lain dead in the grave, his soul lived and had travailed far and along Broadway, where on both sides it grew more sweet, bare and delicate trees and fruits than he had ever seen before. And at length he came to the most fine and fair houses, near which he met his father, who was dead long ago, who gave him charge to go back to show his friends what good there was to do, to enjoy the pleasures of that place. And when he was done, he should come again. Now, 2 centuries later, there was a man called Henry Schoolcraft, and he was a scout, and he was commissioned by the United States government to explore the Mississippi Valley with regard to its mineral sources. So he was out there scouting around, talking to the Native Americans as well. And he gave a very lengthy report, which was published in 1825. And it provoked a lot of interest in the Native Americans by the Western settlers, by some of them anyway. Now, Schoolcraft observed the Native Americans were deists who didn't fear death but regarded it as a change of state that ends a life of both earthly pleasures and hardships, with the emphasis on the diminishment of suffering at death, although some notion of reward and punishment existed. And he wrote that the dead were dressed in their best clothing, and a close relative or elder addressed the deceased as if he or she was still conscious of what was taking place. And they were told what to expect in the afterlife and reminded of their preparation for the trials they would undergo. So here there was inherent in that is an understanding of what's actually going to happen. So these people are told, looks like I was saying to you before about that book by Dr. Peter Fenwick, The Art of Dying. These Native American people already understood what was going to happen and are preparing the dying for that. And that would have taken, if you imagine that, the history of that through their culture and how that information was gathered, and that would have been taught, the shamans would have known that, and they would have probably been a part of that teaching, I guess, to the dead, to the dying. And they said that you're going to another country which we trust you will find pleasant. But in your journey you'll have to be very cautious how you travel, for your path is beset with dangers. And there is one place in particular where you must be extremely cautious. And you have a dark stream to cross which is wide and deep, and the water runs rapidly. And there's but a single tree lying across it, and you'll be compelled to cross over it without the help of a staff. And if your actions have been pleasing to the Great Spirit, you will get safely over. But if not, you'll surely fall into the stream. Mm-hmm. So inherent is that is that judgment. If you've been good in your normal living life, well, great, you'll get across. But if you haven't, it's down. It's not going to happen. And it's interesting, isn't it, when you sort of compare that to things that I was taught in Sunday school. Who went to Sunday school, by the way? Yeah. There must have been a few more of you. My understanding as a child was that if you didn't live a good life, you were going to go to hell. That was the Christian idea. But here we see aspects of that showing up, and I guess you've got to ask yourself, well, where does that Christian idea come from? After describing the custom of building a small fire on the grave of 4 or more nights after a funeral he had witnessed, Schoolcraft proceeded to tell an altered state event associated with death. And he alleged that he recorded an almost word-for-word account told him by Chippewas of the Saul of St. Mary, which is now known as Michigan. And according to the oral history at the time, a small Chippewa war party fought a fierce battle with their enemies, and just as their leader had secured the victory, he was shot in the chest with an arrow and fell dead. And the custom was not to bury the warriors who died in battle. His body was arrayed in his headdress, and he was leaned up against a tree, and looking out so he could see all the people who were attacking, see them all fleeing as they were winning. So evidently the leader wasn't dead, of course. So, however, for though he could neither move nor speak, he later said he heard all his friends had said, and felt their hands arranging his body. He was consumed with a desire to remain with them, and as they departed for home, he made a mighty exertion and seemed to rise and follow their tracks. And however, after repeated anguished attempts to get their attention, he realised that they couldn't see him, and he became frustrated and angry and disappointed. He nevertheless kept pace with them on the long journey. His bodily needs had not ceased, but he was unable, of course, to eat or drink, but his wounds bothered him. The only thing he could do was sleep when they slept, and he berated them for not helping him, but no one seemed to hear his words. And if they heard his voice, they mistook its sound for the winds of summer rustling along the green leaves. The war party finally arrived at their village, where they sang the praises of the fallen leader's bravery to the man's elderly father and his wife. And the more the stories were told, the more indignant the dead leader became, insisting that he had not been killed and left upon the battlefield, but was right in their midst. So obviously they couldn't see him. He was having a near-death experience. Okay, and the more he shouted at them to pay attention, the less they did. Anyway, Shouting as loudly as he could, he demanded that his wife tend his wounds and bring him food, but she merely remarked to someone sitting near that she heard a buzzing in her ear. And her husband got quite enraged and struck her as hard as he could on the forehead, but she merely touched her forehead, saying she must have a slight headache. So I found that really curious because, is it possible for the dead to actually touch us? And I have read stories by people saying that when they've thought of a deceased loved one, they've actually felt the hand on them, just touching them, those sorts of things. Anyway, to cut a long story short, basically he decided that it suddenly dawned on him that perhaps only his spirit had accompanied his friends, and he sort of woke up to the fact that he actually wasn't in his physical body. So he returned to his physical body, and he describes it as actually doing it over a few days. So it took as long in the out-of-body state to get to his home camp, and just as long in our normal time, which is an interesting thing, because usually time in this altered state of consciousness it's very different. The physics and time, it's all quite different. Anyway, he eventually got back to his body, and he saw his body. He was a bit sort of worried about it. But anyway, he eventually went into his body, and it turned out he'd been in a coma for 8 days. So somehow he managed to get back to his tribe, and he let them know. Could you imagine walking? Oh, anyway, I don't want to think about it. But anyway, got back, and of course they would have gone, "Oh my God, you're alive!" And told them the story, and that was how the information got passed on. Now, still on the Native American track, there was this anthropologist called Ruth Bunzel, and she studied the Zuni culture in the early 20th century. And there was this one story that she recorded from someone, and they said, "When I was sick with the measles, I was very sick. And on the 3rd day, I didn't know anything. Maybe I fainted, or maybe I really died and came back. I never believed that could happen, but it really did, because when I came back, the room was going round and round, and there was a little light coming through the window, although there was a bright light in the room. And while I was dead, I dreamed I was going toward the west. I was so happy to see my grandfather. And since then, I've never worried about dying, even when I was very sick, because I saw all these dead people and saw that they were still living the way that we do." Frank Hamilton Cushing. Now, he was an interesting fellow. Of all things, he was interested in Zuni pottery. But he recorded some stories too. A story told to him in 1882 about a young man called Palauativa, who was critically ill and had been too weak to get out of bed for days. And his relatives had been summoned but had not yet arrived. And even though it was daylight, his vision darkened. And then I saw again, this is what the person said, "Then I saw again, and the light was coming through the window at the end of the room, brighter than before, so that all things were clear to me, very clear. I looked around the room, wondering that everything was so much better than it had been for so long, feeling that I no longer need lie there. I saw a broad-shouldered, God-sized man coming toward me. I did not know him. He was dressed in the ancient costume of my people. He came toward me, holding in one hand, which was extended towards the door, a lasso, as though he had led a horse behind him." And the man, I have to read this because I can't, this is a story, so I want you to hear their personal stories. "The man looked down at Palauativa, lying there, and smiled, but instead of expressing the customary greetings, he uttered a single word that is usually translated as meaning, 'Is everything ready?' And Palauativa assented but hesitated, because he did not seem to know the man and could not see his face clearly against the bright light. Now the man explained that he was the sick man's grand-uncle, who had gone away from the Zuni before you were in the womb of your mother," he said. And at this, Palauativa said he was ready, and the man said he had brought 2 fine horses, all saddled and bridled for the journey. And Palauativa was rising easily from his sick bed when a wrinkled little old man, dressed in the most ancient costume of the Zunis, and with his hair done in a strange old-fashioned knot, appeared in the room as though he had walked through one of the walls. Despite his ancient appearance and great age, he moved gracefully and majestically. And the old man told the uncle that it was not time for Palliativa to go, but the uncle disputed him. Eventually, he goes on about this great long conflict that they had, but eventually Palliativa was told to go back and actually lived. So that's the story in a nutshell, basically. But he was told at the end that when the time has come for you to go, that we will come for you. Farewell, be it even as I have said. And the old man turned away, and Palliativa's vision grew dark again. And the next thing he knows, he was awakened. So it's all very interesting, all these stories, aren't they? You can see the similarities to the modern near-death experiences, and you know, with very little outside influence of their culture. So all over the planet, we've got all these different, you know, civilizations and indigenous stories from indigenous people, where these similar afterlife beliefs and reports of near-death experiences have been recorded and have arisen in that, and which is strongly suggests that this is something that is a universal experience to all human beings, and has always been an experience for all human beings too. Yes, yes.
I was thinking, it keeps going on in my mind, that according to the spiritual level of your grouping,
Yeah.
like these are Native American or Native peoples, and even in today's world, Native people still have the same experience because their spirituality is based on shamanistic growth, etc. However, when you look upon other cultures, that even in the same country that has evolved away from the shamanistic experience, their near-death experience will be different, I believe. That is based on their spiritual level of consciousness and their growth patterns of their life in the now. Because we met someone in Bali, and he was telling us that his daughter was his grandmother's, was reincarnation of his grandmother. And he said that that's what they believe, that the family reincarnate within the family. And then I started thinking about that grouping, since they're Hindu and they have that belief, that in that grouping, wherever people think like that, and their spiritual evolution, they will evolve and evolve within the family until something sparks in their consciousness that there's something different. And then they will leave that, it's like a level or a house or a community, and they'll leave that community and start evolving in the next life somewhere else, no longer keeping the evolution within the family of rebirth, going on into another community and growing there. So that's why I believe that the Native American, because I have some Native American in me, and when we were at a powwow, they were saying that the ancestors are all visiting, and you can actually feel them enjoying the powwow. So if that's your consciousness and that you're grouping and that's where you're evolving, then you probably will have that near-death experience in that level. But when you choose to move out of that, you start to experience different things, like your next birth, or your child won't have that I'm Auntie Jane coming back. I mean, it's just a thought.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's some astrological evidence that we reincarnate into same family, similar families, for however long we do that.
Yeah.
If you look at your astrological natal chart, there are always strong connections between the relevant or the most significant placements in your chart in relation to your parents and your children. And I can't talk about that now because it's too long and involved, but just a quick one is I have my moon in Gemini, my mother has her sun in Gemini, my daughter has Gemini rising, so, and that may mean nothing to you, but it just means that when things are in significant places in your charts, that you have these connections. It may not be all with one person, it may be like you're in the middle of a wheel and you've got this connection to a degree, not a complete connection, but in some way, astrologically, to the other people in your family. And I've got a friend who's an astrologer, and she says, and that to me proves that reincarnation. But anyway, our puny little minds can't understand and oversee such a large, the mechanics of our existence. So that's why we have these spirit helpers who sort of help us decide what to do, where to go in the next life too. Because they have a bigger understanding, operate at a bigger level, with a broader perspective where we only just see our life. And then I think sometimes that some people come into our life for a short period of time, like into our orb, and they'll come in and they'll sort of get in sync with our orbit, and then when that's done, whatever it is that needed to be done with that, and they sort of come in, bring in the circumstances arise when they come into your orbit that you then challenge with or deal with or whatever, and then they go out of the orbit again. So I think some people stay with you for your life. This is a near-death experience that I really wanted to read to you properly, because it's a very interesting story, and actually my heart raced a little bit when I read it, because there were just so many things of interest and my mind started to boggle. But this was the near-death experience of Black Elk. And interestingly enough, here on the left, he's about 27 in this photo, apparently. And he was touring with the Buffalo Bill Wild West show in London. But anyway, his story starts because at age 5 he started to hear voices. This is before anything happened. He started to hear voices, and he'd hear what he thought was his mother calling him. And that continued until he was 9. When he was 5 years old, he was riding on horseback when he pulled an arrow to kill a kingbird, when the bird spoke to him. And now, before I had an out-of-body experience where I went into a bird, I would have said, yeah, that's interesting. But now I think birds can talk to you. Because it could be someone inside, who knows. And the bird said, the clouds all over are one-sided, which at that time implied success, such as victory in a battle, and the clouds are promising Black Elk success in the future. That's the understanding of the time by his people. And himself, actually. And then it said, listen, a voice is calling you. And then I looked up at the clouds, and 2 men were coming there, head first like arrows slanting down. And as they came, they sang a sacred song, and the thunder was like drumming. And I will sing it for you. And the song and the drumming were like this. Behold, a sacred voice is calling you. All over the sky, a sacred voice is calling. And Black Elk goes on to say, I sat there gazing at them, and they were coming from the north. But when they were very close to me, they wheeled about toward where the sun goes down. And suddenly they were geese. And geese are symbolic messengers. Then they were gone, and the rain came with a big wind and a roaring. And I didn't tell this vision to anyone. I liked to think about it, but I was afraid to tell it. So this hearing of voices and some visions continued till he was about 9. But when he was 9, he got quite ill, and his body actually swelled up, and the camp was moving, and he couldn't be moved at some times because it was just too painful. But anyway, just before he had the near-death experience, he heard a voice say to him, it's time, now they are calling you. And the voice was so loud and clear that I believed it, and I thought I would just go where it wanted me to go. So I got right up and started, and as I came out of the teepee, both my thighs began to hurt me. And suddenly it was like waking from a dream, and there wasn't any voice. So I went back into the teepee, but I didn't want to eat. Man Hip, I guess that's a friend or someone, looked at me in a strange way and asked me what was wrong, and I told him that my legs were hurting me. So the next day the camp moves, and all this swelling of the body happens, and he puffs up. So he's lying in his teepee, and his mother and father are sitting beside him, and he could see out through the opening. And there were 2 men there coming from the clouds, head first like arrows slanting down again, and I knew they were the same that I had seen before. and each now carried a long spear, and from the points of these a jagged lightning flashed. And they came clear down to the ground this time, and stood a little way off, and looked at me and said, "Hurry, come, your grandfathers are calling you." And then they turned and left the ground like arrows slanting upward from the bow. So he gets up, and when he does, his legs aren't hurting, now he's now out of his body, and you can see his mother and father outside the teepee, and then he goes off into the heavens basically, and he meets the grandfathers. I think it's the council of the 6 grandfathers, and here 6 heavenly grandfathers, and as they talk to him, these rainbows fly over Black Elk's body. And during this, he's healing, okay? And then he drinks from a wooden cup that gives him the power to make him live. He receives visions of a nation. He's given a peace pipe for healing. He's given the red stick of his people, which represents the Lakota people. He's given the spirit of the sky. He sees his higher self reverse in age from an old man to youth. So he then knows how long he's going to live for, which was in his 90s. From that experience, and vision of his future as a healer, leading his people through the struggles to come, and healing his people, and eventually the unity of humanity. So he had this really powerful experience during this near death, and then later on, when he's in London, I think it is, he falls off his chair for some reason. It might have been a stroke or something. I'm not really sure. But then he has another out-of-body near-death experience, and he goes off back up to the place, to the grandfathers again. And then, that's right, then he travels to where his parents are, because remember he's in London now with Wild Bill, and he sees them, and his people there, and his parents, and then he comes back to his body again. So it was a second near-death experience, but not as significant as the first one. In ancient China, we've got 2 stories that describe Taoist NDEs. And one of them goes back to 498 BC. How did that get in here? So there was a ruler, and I won't even try to talk about their names or anything, I won't try and repeat them. But basically there was a ruler who became ill. His physician analysed his condition as equivalent to that of another ruler, who, while in a similar state, experienced being taken to the residence of the Emperor of Heaven. Sounds very majestic, doesn't it? There he learned information about future political events which proved valid, and that's interesting because in NDEs we have access to prophetic information too, don't we? Yes. Things that are about to happen or going to happen in the future. Basing his advice on this precedent, the physician counselled patients, and after 2.5 days, this other person whose name I didn't say, but maybe I should have now, so you know who I'm talking about, Ken Z, awoke and described his NDE. And he met the Emperor of Heaven, and he heard beautiful music. And people have described this beautiful music before too. In fact, there was a woman, and I can't think of the name, but she was, she had interviewed people who had near-death experiences and asking them to describe the music that they had heard. And she had actually put together a CD, I think. Now in another text entitled Sutra on the Merits of, this is the name, Sutra on the Merits of the Fundamental Vows of the Master of Healing, the Lapis Lazuli, Radiance Tath Laga. So you can see why I'm just going to skip over it. Anyway, it was first translated into Chinese early in the 4th century AD, but it narrates the dying person's experiences even more clearly, which this person says. Then talks about their experiences. While his body lies in its original position, he is seized by the messengers of Yama, who led his spirit consciousness before that king of the law. the inborn spirits attached to all sentient beings, who record whether each being's conduct is good or bad, don't we? Will then hand down these records in their entirety to Yama, king of the law. And then the king will interrogate this person, and he will sum up the person's deeds. According to the positive and negative factors, he shall judge him. And that person's consciousness may be returned to his body immediately. And he will clearly remember what he has experienced as if it were a dream. So back then in, 498 BC, there's again an understanding, and this understanding continues through ancient cultures, of what's going to happen when you die. And I find that really curious that it's similar in many, many different cultures. Another early story was a native a native Asian, shall we say, an Asian person, died at the age of 35 during the Jin dynasty, which was 265 to 420. After 10 days, he revived to tell of being carried to the east by 2 horsemen, arriving at a large city wall, passing through the city gate and being presented to the magistrate. He was ordered to describe his sins before a scarlet-clothed individual, who then directed that he take the role of inspector of the Hell's waterworks. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Inspector of the Hell's waterworks. This allowed him to view the harsh punishments in the different hells and note the efficacy of rituals performed by the living for the dead. He followed a group who were released due to these performances and saw a godly person with beautiful countenance. After completing his waterworks inspection, he asked an overseer the means by which one might avoid the hellish tortures, and the overseer informed him that serving the Dharma wipes out even those sins committed before acceptance of it. And after it was discovered that he had been prematurely called to hell due to a bureaucratic error, he was returned to life and directed to inform people of what he had learned. And actually I read a few cases where people were returned because, sorry, we made a mistake. And I just can't quite remember what culture it was in. But I've also heard it in a modern near-death experience report too. I thought the other interesting thing in this story was where he said that he was allowed to view the harsh punishments in the different hells and note the efficacy of rituals performed by the living for the dead. Now if you think about that, that insinuates that what the living do for the dead has some sort of consequence or some sort of an effect. It reminds me of that story I've told some of you before about Daniel Brinkley when he had the near-death experience and he was in some beautiful garden with a spiritual being, and he asked what were these beautiful lights, I think it was, that were sort of filtering up through the garden, and the being said they were people's prayers for the dead. So there's sort of like a connection there, isn't there? There's some sort of relevance of what the living do and how it affects them. Now, Dr. Alan Keller here, I didn't even know he existed. He's an expat over in living in the UK, working in the UK. And he's written a book called Experiences Near Death, Beyond Medicine and Religion, which I've never heard. And I've seen a lot of near-death experience books. But he says, some Asian people do not report having out-of-body experiences, reviews of their lives, or the presence of a white light. Experiences common to most cultures, however, include seeing dead acquaintances and having an opportunity to peek at the world beyond. And I have read that in Japan they don't have the tunnel, they go into a cave instead of going into a tunnel. In other places they go on a journey in a canoe on a river. So, you know, while there are threads, golden threads that run through all near-death experiences, they seem to be bathed in the culture of the time, shall we say it like that.
Maybe it's to make you more comfortable, you know, to not so scared or something.
But some of the things you just mentioned relate to ancient Greek culture also, like the rivers, crossing the river Styx and playing the ferryman and the cave. So there's a link there.
Yeah. So with the Vikings, this was quite interesting too. The afterlife, or focusing on the Norse, our Viking group, the afterlife in Norse myths relates to the Book of Edda and refers to a place in the afterlife called Hel, H-E-L, which of course is H-E-L-L in English, which is beneath the earth but not necessarily in the earth because the sun shines on it. It's more like a shadow world and was once the default place for everyone. And there was another place called Valhalla, which we've come to know as Valhalla, where only slain men who die in battle go. And over time, we've come to know it's here that the female beings known as the Valkyrie choose who will go to Valhalla. So that when they've got the soldiers dead on the battlefield or whatever it is, the Valkyrie come down and they choose who's going to go to Valhalla and I guess who doesn't. And of course we have Plato. Lived from 427 to 347 BCE. And in one of the last chapters in his book, The Republic, he talks about the myth of Well, now let me just go on things straight. The Greeks, when they use the word myth, they mean the story. They don't mean it like myth like we use today. They mean like the story of just let me go to my last few notes on this one. And of course Plato understood that there is an afterlife, that we can leave our physical bodies, and he wrote about that and all this stuff too. So the myth of talks about a man who died on a battlefield and returned to life 9 days later, and recounting what happened in the afterlife. He died on the battlefield, and along with the souls of the other combatants, he was led to a magnificent place that had 4 doors. 2 into and out of the sky, and 2 into and out of the earth. And there were judges who decided which path each soul should follow depending on the life they had led on earth. And the good ones were told to go to the sky, while the bad ones were led into the earth. And from the sky exit, souls that appeared clean came out, telling of a place that filled them with incredible feelings. And the souls that emerged from the earth exit were dirty and were talking about the misery and the difficulties they faced for punishment of what they had done while alive. And some souls, however, those of murderers and other criminals, were not allowed to exit the earth and remain trapped forever. So again, there's that connection with the deeds, isn't it? The deeds and where you're going to go. It goes back a long way, that belief, doesn't it?
It does.
It really does. Makes you wonder where... It just makes you wonder, because remember that, I've shown it at one of the meetings, I think it was Dr. Raj Party, and an Indian doctor who he had a near-death experience where he went to hell. I think he's written a book about it now. And he went to hell before he went to a sort of heaven-like place. And he was a bit upset about that. But he said he was also not a good man before that. And that that experience helped him change his ways.
Didn't Brinkley say that when he died, he got to feel and see everyone that he had hurt? Everyone. So it's not like when you get there, it's like while you're going there, you get to experience every experience you've ever had with anybody, according to some near-death experiences I read, especially Brinkley's, because he was really an awful man, according to him and from what he said. And he got to experience what he did to other people through them. He got to feel them as he was dying. So, so I feel that if, from what I received in my own inner guidance, is that in that other place where you go, if you have done great crimes, there is a school of learning, that dimension of deep learning, and you're being taught to love until it's time for you to come and try again.
Yes.
And so that's what I feel. Sometimes those people who have been there a long time, they come back and they just can't get love again, and they go and create more. That's why the earth is having such a hard time evolving into love and light, because a lot of people come back and continue.
Have no idea.
They just don't know how to choose love,
In these stories, there's judgment by others, but in modern stories, we judge ourselves by being in the shoes of the other person and receiving what we deal out. So that's interesting in itself. Now, whether that's cultural or whether it's a sign of the times that we're now having to be responsible for ourselves, which I think there is a lot of that going on. that we're this is the age of self-responsibility, isn't it? You know, you don't put your faith in the doctor anymore. You look at other things. You know, you don't put your faith in the churches. You don't put your faith in the government. You're responsible for yourself. You know, so and it's about a time of getting rid of the middlemen. So maybe that's part of that spiritual evolution that all of humanity is going through. I don't know, because I don't know what other cultures believe now. I'm only reading what they believed in the past. Earl was told that he would not be judged and that he should remain there in order to see the whole procedure and report it back to mankind. So basically, he's there to learn and then to go back and teach his people, it would be initially. And that's a very shamanic thing to do, to have this journey, experience and learn things, and then go back to your tribe and teach the tribe what you learned during that experience. So in that respect, it's sort of, you know, it's got that shamanic hint to it. Now, 7 days later, after he's had experience, they were all led to another place where there was the spindle of necessity. This is up here. This is the goddess Ananke, who is the primordial goddess and personification of fate. So basically the goddess of fate. And there the souls were given a lottery number of all things. Of course they wouldn't have used that word, but something like a lottery number. And based on that, each of them was told to ask what their next life should be. And the first soul, having travelled through the sky in the previous area, decided to become a dictator. And when that happened, though, he didn't realise that he was destined to eat his own children because of his actions. Realised that the souls that had travelled through the sky and had not lived the punishment of the other path often chose bad things for the next life, while the opposite happened for the souls that had been punished. Curious. So once the souls chose their next life, they were led under the throne of necessity to the river Leith, which is forgetfulness. I guess is where we have the veil and you forget about your previous experiences, where they were told to drink in order to forget their previous lives. And that night, when each soul fell asleep, they were sent to new bodies to lead their new lives. Er's soul did not go through all of this and did not drink from the river of Leith, so he remembered everything he had experienced. And when he woke up, he returned to his old body, which had not decomposed during that period, but he found himself on the funeral pyre that his fellow soldiers had started. And they saved him from the flames, and he managed to recount his experiences in the afterlife. So that's it's a pretty interesting near-death come judgment, come choices to be made, some lessons to be learned, and then returned and change your life basically, and teach other people how to change their life too. Of course, we have to cover the Egyptians. This is the last one. Couldn't do this without the Egyptians. So, the Egyptians believed in the Duat, which is the underworld. And this is a realm that existed alongside the physical realm that we inhabit during our lifetime. And the Duat, I don't even know if I'm saying that properly, Duat, is an invisible region that borders on and interpenetrates the world of the living. And in this region are to be found gods and demons as well as the spirits of the dead. And they also believe that it was only through entering that region that the experience of inner spiritual illumination could come about. And that's interesting too, because, I mean, if you think today about all the people who meditate and do all these other things to try and have that moment of, or some sort of peak experience where they have great insight and reach nirvana, shall we say, but momentarily. But they believe that couldn't be done unless you're actually dying. Curious. So, in ancient Egypt, each new king was thought to be a direct reincarnation of the god Osiris. And this was tested by sealing the initiate god king in a sarcophagus until starved of oxygen, and he had a near-death experience. I wonder how many people died accidentally. That could be a problem, couldn't it? The ritual was carried out in the Great Pyramid by a group of priests and pharaohs and was known as the cult of Osiris. And when the lid of the sarcophagus was opened, after about 8 minutes, the person was revived by the rush of air and then described what happened to them. And these descriptions are recorded in the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
Worried.
And are similar to what are described as near-death experiences. Well, what I'm sharing with you today is just some researchers, or I guess I should say some anthropologists and archaeologists too, I suppose, their interpretation of the information that they've found. Anyway, just in closing, near-death experiences seem to me, anyway, to be universal experiences, but filtered through those cultural layers, like I was saying before. And in them, all of these people have out-of-body experiences. They journey to other realms. They encounter supernatural beings. They meet deceased relatives. There's some sort of obstacle or barrier, a judgment or evaluation of early life. They can experience joy and peace as well as those hellish sort of situations too. And it does, like I was saying earlier, I wonder if these experiences are part of our spiritual heritage, as in all mystical experiences might be too, you know. I'm not sure, but I'd be happy to hear some thoughts on that if anyone would like to share. But anyway, that gives you an overall idea of different cultures and the near-death experiences that other people have had. Does this sort of give you any insights that you sort of go, yes,
I have something that, I don't know, I think they bury us too soon.
Yes?
Because there's 2 of them. The Native American man, after 10 days, he woke up from his, and he came from his near-death experience. And now you have the Roman, 9 days, and came back. I heard that they bury people quickly and seal them so they won't wake up.
Yeah.
Remember they had this? I wonder how many near-death experiences have we missed because they want to put us in the ground so quickly and fumigate us to keep us from bringing this news, which I feel is the news from the spirit world to tell you how to have a better life.
Yeah.
Because if you come back, you have a purpose.
The story of George Rodnaya, who was in the morgue for 3 days. And remember that story where he was they were doing the and his eyes opened. And
my God!
Yeah, his eyes opened, and the what do they call them? The medical. Yeah, medical.
The pathologist.
Yeah, well, not a pathologist, but that mortician type. And just thought, oh, that's just a death reflex, you know. And then kept cutting, and the eyes opened again, and thought, oh, okay, and kept cutting, and the third time his eyes opened, and he just said, oh, there's something here going on here. He gets the light and looks at his eyes, and the pupils are doing their thing, and but he was dead for 3 days, and in that time he was out of his body, and he was visiting his wife. He was mourning and wondering who was going to help to raise the children. And there was one case that I read, which was someone had gone to the had the near experience, gone to the afterlife, and they were standing in front of who they believed to be God, some sort of spiritual person they believed God, shining this beautiful white light and being bathed in all the love, and standing right next to them was a murderer. And that person was loved just as much as what they were. So, this idea of judgment after death or judging people, it may be something that is culturally based, and maybe it actually doesn't happen. Just to finish this off though, in that book by Dr. Alan Callagher, he says, in previous generations it was said that death is a dark country and that never far away one finds its major cities, loss, grief and aloneness. However, in our time another idea has emerged, namely that beyond that shadowy country lies another less inhospitable land, a land of fabulous light and landscape in which one finds the cities called learning, love and service. Something to think about.
That's supposed to be what we're learning here.